Challenger Dominiel has just been buffed, and as someone who absolutely loved playing her, I'm super excited for her change as the adjustments are pretty simple and they also make her way easier to use. Cdom, however, has always been built around critical hits, and with this, your team crits, she gets pushed forward, she gains attack, and then she comes in to delete an important target. But now she's easier to build, gives a much better damage buff to the team, and still has one of the biggest advantages in epicseven, which is that she's a mage, and that means that she can hold Tagahel's ancient book. Now, of course, today we'll be going over what's changed, why it matters, and whether Cdom is worth using again, but without further ado, let's get straight into it. So, the first thing you should know about Cdom is that in terms of how she wants to be played, you are naturally going to be pairing her with opener characters or just fast characters in general, and this can include characters like Briar Witch Iceria, characters like Lidica, or even characters like Ran. This, of course, depends exactly on what exactly the meta is or how things pan out, but overall, Cdom is pretty versatile, at least for the moment. With this though, every time that an ally crits, no matter who the opener is, she gains combat readiness and stackable attack, but of course you aren't limited to only getting these crits from openers, you can get this from any ally in general. This makes her pretty scary in aggressive teams though, because your Cdom can start the fight, or rather your opener will start the fight, land multiple crits, push Cdom forward, and then you have something like a very powerful S3 into S1 to snipe and buff the team. Now, of course, she also adds value through the ancient Tagahel book here, and with it, she gives your team souls, which can then be extremely important for your opener, as they often have some soul burn or some 20 cost soul burn that is pretty impactful, especially if you're able to make use of these effects. So she's not just a damage dealer, she also acts as a pretty powerful support, just because she thankfully, is labeled or is given the role of a mage in general. Now, in terms of the buffs and what to expect specifically, let's start with the S2. The first buff is to her passive Electric Charge. With it, Cdom now gains 30 crit chance for free, but the biggest deal here isn't that she's easier to build. I would argue in some cases another major part of this is actually the fact that Cdom is one of the rare characters with a crit chance release imprint. Now this is relevant because openers can then sometimes use this imprint to avoid building as much crit chance themselves, and you can focus these stats elsewhere, which is especially helpful if you're trying to play one of these fast openers, including characters like Briar or Lidica, but you aren't at liberty or you don't have a particularly very good crit chance necklace. Now, moving back to her though, I do also want to talk about the changes to Cdom's S3 because this is also pretty relevant too. With it, her S3 was changed in a pretty relevant way, I'd say, in general. Before, Supercharge gave the team crit chance as a buff, but now this gives the team a crit damage buff instead. Now, this is pretty insane and pretty helpful for a couple of reasons, but what I would say, I guess, the main reason why I feel that this fits best is because most teams wouldn't really be able to make use of the former crit chance buff after Cdom has already taken the turn, which is most likely when you'd be able to use this S3, which is what, in my opinion, would kind of make the buff less often than not actually useful. But instead, having this crit damage buff right now means that characters taking the turn after Cdom will simply hit harder when they crit, especially with it having been buffed, or rather the C damage buff being buffed to 70% instead of 50 from the past. As a side note, again, C damage is always pretty helpful, especially if you're trying to utilize something like a triple torrent set, which I wish I had, but in this case, using or trying to have enough crit damage in general sometimes, or rather, not overcap on your crit damage sometimes, is pretty helpful, as otherwise, if you're trying to use something like a Destro set, you do kind of have to avoid overcapping a significant amount with things like your attack next and avoiding crit damage from the certain pieces that you have in general. However, beyond all this though, she does still give the team a 25% combat readiness push with this S3, and she gets an extra turn after using it, which honestly, both of these are pretty helpful depending on the niche or the team that you're using, but in general, not only do you gain this obviously huge CR push from the S3, you also now increase the crit damage and also give an attack increase, which we'll get into in a moment, or actually right now, when it comes to special equipments. Now, the special equipments have changed for Cdom, and generally speaking though, you definitely want this attack buff on S3 one, as this is another way for you to basically add utility to the team, which is going to be very relevant. Now, with this, after the buff, Supercharge already gives your team crit damage buff, pushes everyone forward by 25%, and gives Cdom the extra turn, as we mentioned earlier. But with this additional EE, of course, now you give attack increase, which means that in one button, you give crit damage, attack, combat readiness push, and you get an extra turn to follow up herself, which is honestly a pretty insane amount of setup from a one button or a one turn sort of character. Now, in terms of this though, the buff, I would say, doesn't necessarily change what Cdom does, it just makes her better at the role that she already had. She's easier to gear, naturally, because of all the free crit chance. Her team damage buff is now stronger, and she also brings even more value, I'd say, in general, before you're attacking. Now, this is exactly what I would describe to be the kind of change that she needed, but we actually need to talk a moment about Book. Now, Book here is super important, as this is, again, one of the strongest artifacts in the game, as it gives souls at the start of battle. To be clear, you could also technically, instead of this Tag of Hell's Book here, you could use something like Freeman's Artifact, but as that is a limited artifact and quite expensive, or quite limited or more difficult to obtain, we're going to refer to this one for the purposes of this section. That said, since Cdom is a mage, she can of course bring a book while being a real damage threat, and this is pretty important, as again, a lot of characters are simply picked for the book so that you can ignore effect resistance, deal with the resistance card in RTA, or things of this things of this nature. Now, with this, so when a mage in general can just hold a book while also giving buffs, this effectively makes them one of the stronger options that you have in terms of picking order, or even in general usage for a character. And a character that I think shares a similar fate to this is actually Dien, who, again, despite having a very overloaded and very powerful kit, synergizes perfectly and is kind of the epitome of what a mage can really do, or why mages are super impactful, as her entire kit revolves around this idea of soul burning and books, and is super impactful and super strong as a result of it. A bit of a teaser, she is also going to be someone that you'll end up using quite a bit, I'd imagine, with Cdom, but again, we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, as for teams though, the classic Cdom team is usually centered again around a super fast opener, whether that's someone like Briar, whether you choose to take someone like Salome, characters like Lidica, even sometimes characters like Top Model Lulika. However, your opener is usually someone like, again, the aforementioned characters before, mostly because they can crit early, push Cdom forward, or get something like, defense breaks applied across a team, strip, etc. Then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, you can add characters like the Cdom or even the Dien earlier on so that you can push back and also not only hold Book herself, but in a lot of cases, she can also act as another way to stack the Cdom, which is pretty nice just in general, especially as, of course, you're going to do a decent amount of damage herself with the S3, in addition to, of course, stacking your Cdom. Now, for the DPS slot, you could also pair someone like Cdom with other DPSs too. I would say in most cases, Cdom isn't necessarily the single or exclusive DPS that you'd have on a team, and instead you can use characters like the newly buffed Arbiter Vildred, or even characters like the normal green Vildred if you're trying to cook around or if you're trying to do a bunch of damage. Again, I would say though, in general, both of these characters already do quite well, especially if you're going to use or give them something like Sword of Summer Twilight. You give them, something like an attack and crit damage buff, which you'd get from Cdom, and you'd, of course, do a bajillion, quadrillion damage. Now, with this, a standard, or I'd say a standard more looking team would probably look something like Briar plus Lidica. You have Shepherd of the Shepherd Dien, and you'd have Cdom alongside another DPS. But of course, depending on the matchup, the DPS slot can also be replaced by a control unit, including characters like, again, Silverblade Araminta or even Koli. But in this case, I'd actually like to highlight and showcase sort of what you can expect when it comes to someone like the Cdom at the moment, where even with something like this, you are definitely able to, in a lot of cases, either run an opener plus an imprint, or you may be able to stack a bunch of different buffs or stack a bunch of different crits so that you can take the turn with Cdom, one shot a priority target, and then go from there. As you're seeing though, again, this is more of a speedier or faster sort of team composition, which makes sense, obviously, because I'm racing the Renak, and a lot of what you're seeing here is, of course, predicated on outspeeding, but Cdom is definitely one of the strongest characters here, or one of the strongest options that you could pick here, as again, not only do you get to push and obviously activate, but Cdom here, though she may not necessarily do as much as you'd think, especially since Villager is likely to activate, you do have the backup here of, in case one of these characters doesn't die, say in short, for this Biblis character here, you are able to use her S3, give yourself the attack buff, and I've probably done like 1 billion damage here, and yeah, you could see that did 42,000, which makes sense as I effectively had 12 crits stacked, something insane like that, and of course it is a single target nuker type DPS. That said, this isn't a character without weaknesses, and there's a reason why Cdom has only recently come back into popularity. This is mostly because her soul burn is super impactful, and with this, the obvious or most prominent counter to someone like Cdom is going to be anti-bookholder type characters, including Bellion, or even on occasion, sometimes characters like ML Arya, though that isn't necessarily a one-to-one counter. That said, most of the time you're going to soul burn your opener instead, which actually does pose another weakness for Cdom, as if your opener isn't a bookholder yourself or themselves, or if you don't have a secondary bookholder who doesn't necessarily need to use their soul burn, in most cases, what you'll end up having is a Cdom that isn't able to actually use her soul burn S1 to do more damage, which means that she will oftentimes actually act more as a buffer or a pseudo DPS, as opposed to your, I guess, your former main DPS start, which is what she was in the past. Now, again, there are other weaknesses to Cdom, and again, this mostly has to do with her reliance on this S2 passive. If your opener misses crit, or if the enemy has anti-crit or evasion, she also becomes much less threatening. And so, even though she's stronger now, she does still need the correct team around her, which is, again, part of the reason why I think someone like Shepherd of the Dark DN is pretty strong, as she is able to, in most cases, either seal an evasion or an anti-crit or some sort of annoying debuff, alongside, of course, also being able to strip in certain cases, depending on, of course, the ER of the target. Now, overall, though, this is, I would say, one of the stronger buffs for Cdom. She isn't a completely different character by any means, but she's definitely easier to use and more rewarding in the right teams. With this, though, cleave and aggressive players, I'd say, should definitely consider playing this character again, or at the very minimum, test her out to see if your teams or your cleave that you're using at the moment can utilize her. If you're focused on book, I guess, like in general, or if you're someone that doesn't necessarily cleave, but you are interested in picking characters like the Zio or characters like the New Moon Luna, I do think she may be an interesting or maybe niche option in certain cases. If you're a slow bruiser player, there's really no reason to use a character like this, but otherwise, if you're an existing Cdom owner as well, this is definitely a character that should be worth, or that would be worth rebuilding if you had any interest in her in the past. With this as a reminder, again, she brings books. She has crit damage buff, attack increase, self-crit chance, combat readiness push, and strong single target damage all in one slot. And this is a pretty strong combo in a game that honestly does require you to have lots of different appealing aspects in order to justify picking them. Overall, though, Cdom's buff makes her a cleaner and stronger version of exactly what she was always supposed to be, and honestly, though in certain cases you may not be able to run someone like Cdom, depending on what the arena or whatever defense you encounter is in arena, guild war, etc., I still think that, especially in RTA, this is going to be a character that you are definitely going to be able to pick. Otherwise, if you are able to avoid some of the Scales, Harcetes, some of these really, really annoying damage-sharing characters in general, I think she's going to be quite strong, especially if you're keeping up with turn 1 or very fast, speedier compositions. Otherwise, though, guys, that's everything I have for Cdom. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you all in the next one, though. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.